Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Thanks as always for listening, and very excited this week to be joined by Eamonn Brennan, who writes his own newsletter on Substack called Buzzer. Eamonn, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink.
How we doing, man?
How is it 1 year into to your endeavor? How have things been going? I know last time we talked, you mentioned a lot of interest from Virginia fans and Indiana fans, kind of also being particularly interested in the things that you write. How's kind of been the journey now as this, I guess, solopreneur?
Yeah. No, it's been good. The season was really good. Honestly, I think starting it last summer, it's just been just over a year. I think it was June 20th that it launched last year. And I think starting it in that dead of summer made for a really scary start because it's hard to let people know where you are and what you're doing at that time of the year. Like, you know how it goes. College basketball ebbs and flows in terms of interest, and the number of people who are seeing you on social media is not really within your control anymore. It's very algorithmic now. And so I think there were probably all the way until the fall, late fall, winter, and especially like January, February, and March when I started doing Bubble Watch again. There were a lot of people who just didn't know that I'd left the Athletic at all because they're not on Twitter, or they, never check it or whatever. But there was a solid, hardcore group of people who signed up from the beginning. And that grew over the summer as people, more and more people, figured out where I was. And so by the time we got to the season, by the time we got to Bubble Watch and the run up to the tournament and the tournament itself, and we started doing live chats, we had like a community that was already in place, that had been engaging with stuff throughout. And it was much easier to build on because there was something for people to come to. Right. So that worked out really well. I think interest definitely peaked during those months. Not surprisingly, because that's how college basketball coverage tends to go. But the numbers are good, and I think we're building for year two from a much better position than when it started in year one, and it's been super satisfying and really fun to just kind of like figure things out on the fly, write stuff that interests me, kind of play around with some stuff here and there, have a couple things that really hit with people, and engage with a group of people who are here to read my stuff and chat, and it's been a lot of fun.
That's great. Glad to hear everything's going well. I know you did a great job with Bubble Watch for so many years at various places, and I know people are glad that you're continuing on. Unfortunately for Indiana fans, there was no real reason to look at Bubble Watch last year from a Hoosier perspective, and that's why you're here to kind of to help me make sense of where things are right now with Indiana, where they're going in the future. I just want to kind of take a big picture look from your perspective. Last season, entering the year, I think a lot of us didn't really know what to expect, but there was at least a reasonable expectation that Indiana had the talent, the pieces to be at least a contender to make the NCAA tournament. I don't know that people would have said like this is a surefire tournament team, but you look at the final record and where they were in Ken Palm, and really after that first month of the season where they had a ton of what we like to call guarantee games, and Indiana really didn't perform well enough in any of those games to make their computer numbers pop at all, and they kind of had a slow decline from that perspective, and obviously missed out by a pretty wide margin from the tournament. I mean, just from watching from afar, I know you keep pretty close tabs still on the program, but you're kind of covering things from a national perspective. What were kind of your impressions of last season from an IU perspective? What went wrong, and how surprised were you at just really how bad of a performance it was overall for the program?
Yeah, a bit surprised. I mean, I think one of the things I wrote in the off season that I think got a fair amount of attention from Indiana fans was that I thought the season would really hinge on how well Xavier Johnson played, and that he was probably coming into the season being a little bit underrated, given his age, given experience, given the fact that he was hurt for much of the previous year, and that his, sort of the last time you'd seen him, which is easy to forget when a guy's out for a long time, he played really, really well. That I guess it was toward down the tail end of um the season when they were kind of on the bubble. That would have been
Yeah,
2 years ago
the
now, right?
first Woodson year.
So yeah, first Woodson year. He in the last 6 weeks of that season played the best basketball of his career. And so you're thinking, okay, he started off pretty well the previous year. Can he come back to that level as sort of the captain of the team, been around college basketball forever? And it didn't happen for a variety of reasons. And I think that was the big thing that sort of set the season off in the way that it did. I mean, I think, um, yeah, like going back to it from a pure sort of, do you want to get in the tournament perspective, you got to beat Florida Gulf Coast and Army and Wright State by double digits. And I
Yeah.
know people hate that. Like, I know there's a lot of old school fans who are like, what are you talking about? All that matters is that you win. It's like, no, it's not the RPI anymore. And frankly, if you if Connecticut beats you 77 to 70 instead of 77 to 57, it looks a little bit better as well because it seems like you were competitive in that game. I realize that, again, people say, well, you still lost the game, but that's the best team in the country, and they're gonna be a barometer, but mathematically for every team they play against. And so, the same went for the Auburn game. Kansas was obviously a huge missed opportunity, and so they come out of the non-conference, and not only do beat Morehead State by a point at home, not only do the numbers look bad, but you don't have any real quality wins to speak of. And you go into the Big Ten season and spend essentially the first 2 months of it just not really playing very well at all. Shooting a huge issue, lack of attempts from three by a large margin, close to the bottom in the Big Ten. I mean, bad shooting when they do shoot threes. Like, again, you talked about Virginia. They never shot threes last year, but when they did, they almost went in because they had one guy who could make threes, and Isaac McNeely. He made him almost like a 50% clip. So they were a good 3-point shooting team. They just didn't get volume with it, and so they didn't generate that many points with it. So Indiana was bad at both, right? Like, they not only did they never shoot a three when they did, it didn't go in.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just have this offense that essentially in 2024 is relying on constant post ups, Khalil Ware playing ISO at the elbow, Trey Galloway trying to drive at people. And so functionally speaking, it just never really worked. And even when they got good late in the year, or got better and late, they won four games in a row down the stretch of the season. That got them kind of into a bubble conversation, but never really. Um,
Yeah.
it still wasn't like free flowing offensive stuff. They just got better defensively, I think, and like it started to play at a reasonably high level on defense, which is something they did the previous year under Woodson, and which is I think is something that he can recreate with his like desire to have really long physical guys at most positions, but you need people who can shoot, and they never got there. And so that, their numbers never really got to the point where you consider them a potential tournament team, and they weren't, they were stagnant and not super functional for pretty much the entire season.
Yeah, one of the things that I think I've heard most from fans, and it's something I've thought about a lot with just Indiana under Woodson. And over the years, in different media availabilities, kind of tried to ask him this, not maybe this exact question, but just different questions, like philosophically about like what he wants his team to be, like what he wants the program to be, how he wants to play. And it almost seems like he doesn't want to, there was a clip, I think, after the season where Danny Hurley was talking just kind of like schematic stuff. It went viral on Twitter, I think, and just it was like a fascinating like 3 or 4 minute clip of just him like talking X's and O's. And I was like, I've never heard like Mike Woodson talk this way or kind of spell out what he wants his identity for his program to be. I mean, how important is it for Indiana to establish? I mean, I know that they like to play through the post, but it doesn't feel like there's any identity of like what they're building from style of play or what they want to do. Is it important for them to kind of define that moving forward and kind of establish some parameters of like what things they want to do well? Because right now it just seems like we're not going to shoot a lot of threes. We want to get fouled, but we can't make free throws. Offensively, to me, it kind of feels like they're just relying on let's try to get as much talent as we can, throw it out there, and try to win that way. And to me, it doesn't seem from a schematic standpoint there's a whole lot to hang your hat on. Am I reading that wrong? I mean, you're kind of more in the weeds in terms of like the X's and O's. I feel like than I am in style of play. I'm just kind of curious, like what you see from what Woodson wants this Indiana program to be. Because when you ask him about it, like throughout the season, is just like, well, we just work, we try to get better, and it's like that doesn't really tell you anything about like what he thinks about how he wants to play.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that is probably not unexpected for a guy who spent most of his career not having really any control over the players that were sent to him to be coached, right? I think Mike Woodson was never so powerful an NBA coach that he had a significant voice in the players that, he wasn't Phil Jackson. So like Phil Jackson at the Lakers could be like, no, I don't want that guy. He doesn't fit what we were trying to do in the triangle offense or whatever. Um, Mike Woodson was a guy who was at teams that got put together by general managers, and Mike Woodson was a functional, average, occasionally above average NBA coach, who everybody respected and liked and would work hard for, but who wasn't devising medium or long-term strategic systems or tactics, right?
Yeah,
So I think that that's probably part of it. I think that his view, and I don't think it's a totally crazy one, is that if you get me talented guys, I'll put them in functional systems that I know will work, and they're not going to reinvent the wheel, but we'll spread the floor, we'll play pick and roll, we'll play through the high post, we'll post guys up, we'll try and kick out, stuff that is time tested and can work if you have Trace Jackson Davis on the team, but is not the stuff that you see at the highest level of college basketball, where you see people like Hurley and his staff at Connecticut or Nate Oates and his staff at Alabama really breaking things and doing something different and completely committing to a style of play, that you recruit to 100%. And if you can't shoot, Alabama is not even going to look at you. If you're not a 32, 33% three-point shooter who's willing to fire it at all times, Alabama does not care about you. They will never recruit you, and they're not interested. And you can swerve on that if you want to, but that has to be what you're committed to. And so again, I think if you squint hard enough, you can see like you can build a really good defense with a bunch of guys who are bigger for their positions than everybody else that they're playing against. And I think this Indiana team has a chance to be that. If you go up and down, there's a world in which like Trey Galloway is the shortest guy on the floor pretty frequently for this Indiana team. But I think on the other end, that the number one reaction I had to Umar Ballo committing to Indiana this year was not, oh my God, what a get. That's an amazing player. Even though that's true, he's a great college basketball player. He will be a really good player for Indiana. It was, how's he going to play next to Malik Reneau? How does this work? Is Reneau going to become, because he touched on it a little bit last year. He was a bit more of a perimeter shooter. He faced up a bit more last year. I don't know what his his all-in three-point tally was last year. It was respectable and very minimal volume, I think. But is he going to be a guy who can stretch the floor? Because if not, and you're posting both of those guys up, go back and watch Arizona play. They don't have two bigs on the floor with Ballo very much, because Tommy Lloyd is from the Mark Few school of spacing the floor, getting guys up and down. You have one big guy who's just in the paint all the time. So I do think that lacking that clear stylistic identity is the kind of thing that can hold you back, even if you have a lot of talent, because you end up in a situation where, like, you go up and down and look at Indiana's roster and the guys they brought in this year, and any one of them in isolation, when they're announced on Twitter, it's like another great get for Indiana, another great get for Indiana. Wow, look at these promising young transfers for Indiana, freshmen, sophomores, guys from the Pac-12, Miles Wright, like it all looks good in isolation. And then you step back for a second, you try to think about how they're going to fit in a team. And it doesn't quite make as much sense when you look at a game that is dominated twice in a two times in a row now at the national title level by a Connecticut team that spaced the floor, ran great stuff, had guys that could shoot, an Alabama team that runs up and down and chucks threes constantly. Like it's a different world out there, and the stuff that they played last year, I don't think works. And I think they've upgraded the talent all around, but I don't know that they've thought about how that talent is going to fit together unless guys just surprise you and become much better 3-point shooters than they've been so far in their careers.
So how many coaches in your estimation are kind of in that same mold of Hurley and Oates where they're kind of, as you mentioned, breaking stuff? I guess to kind of reframe the question is, can you still be a really good team, be a really successful team if you don't have a coach that's kind of, doing something unique like that? I mean, with what Indiana brought in, can they put these pieces together in such a way that where you can contend for, I think second weekend should be the goal next season.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious. You kind of mentioned these pieces in isolation. They look good one by one, but can they fit together to build a team that's gonna kind of meet that goal, that expectation?
Well, I mean, certainly there's a world in which it could happen. I mean, I think another coach like this, and I covered him when I was a student reporter in Indiana, so it's not taboo of me to say or whatever, but is Kelvin Sampson at Houston, where you give Kelvin Sampson a roster, a starting seven, let's say, with this much talent, size, physicality, and you would expect him to turn them into, would they be able to shoot? Probably not. Would they shoot a lot of threes? Yes, just by the math. And what they would do is grab an offensive rebound like 50% of the time. You know what I mean? Like Ballo and Renew would just be destroying guys. But the reason why that would be the case for Sampson is he would recruit players who are completely 100% dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Like the doggest of the dogs that you can find in North America. He recruits the most locked in maniacs on the planet, right? And they just completely buy in. If you don't buy in, like Caleb Mills, we're not interested in you. You could be a 5-star. I don't care. We try to pepper some of that talent in. Doesn't matter. If you're not with it, go play somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so that is another example of recruiting to what you want to do, except with him, it's like emotional and mental and physical with defense and offensive rebounding. And if we can shoot the ball, great, we might win a national title. If not, we're still going to be a number one seed. So I think, there are like I mentioned Tommy Lloyd. I think the stuff they run at Arizona is pretty similar to what Gonzaga runs. I don't think he's like reinvented it completely, but he puts the right pieces in that system, and it's pretty modern, and they get up and down the floor and they space it and they get a lot of open looks in transition. I think like Shaka Smart as completely a really good example of a coach who's evolved over the years, as was like a big pressing guy at VCU. Obviously, everyone remembers that.
Yeah.
Has now become like the modern offense guy where they basically don't run ball screens anymore. I mean, they do, but like a lot of it is off ball movement and spatial relationships and stuff. So there's a lot of people doing a lot of different stuff. I mean, I think Mark Pope has some interesting stuff that's going to go in at Kentucky. I don't think he's like recruited like Cal, and maybe that will work. Maybe it won't. He's got a lot of guys on that roster who are going to want to play, who aren't like NBA lottery pick type players. But, his team's offenses at BYU are always good because all their big guys could always pass. It's just stuff like that, I think I can see in the abstract, again, if you squint, why Indiana staff would look at a guy like Ballo and be like, he can give us the Jackson Davis stuff. You know what I mean? He can give us a similar thing to that. I just think it's hard to imagine Indiana, the way it's been run offensively for the last couple seasons, creating enough space for both him and Renew to be comfortable on the offensive end, not feel like there's someone standing on top of them all the time, and having options on the perimeter that are going to shoot the ball. Yeah, besides one guy, Luke Goody, who is a good 3-point shooter. But you need, again, you need, ideally, you would like 3 or 4 of those on the floor at any given time in 2024. And I think Indiana has a couple.
And realistically, I mean, Goody's what, a 15 to 18 minute a game guy. I mean, I don't think
And you'll be
he's
giving up defense with him too. It's not like he's a particularly great wing defender. I think there's a reason, even for an Illinois team that couldn't guard anybody to save its life last year, he didn't play more minutes, right? It's because like they had
right.
a ton of offense anyway, but he also is not a good defender.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're banking on Mbako's 3 point percentage moving up because if you look at the Big Ten
Yeah.
only splits there, I mean, that was I think 38% in Big Ten play, which is good. And then
Yeah.
Miles Rice, I think, had a stretch where he missed like I don't know the exact number, but I want to say it was like 25 plus threes in a row that really kind of tanked his percentage. But at one point, he was a pretty solid and three
So I
point
mean, the
shooter percentage
staff,
wise.
so you cover them, regularly. Like they acknowledge they need shooting, right? Like, is that
Yeah, yeah. I
okay?
mean,
All right.
they do, but it's comments like a couple of years ago he made a comment about not running things. It's like it's not his job to run stuff for Miller Kopp, and it was kind of like, well, Miller Kopp's not going to go get a shot for himself, so you better run something for him, or he's not going to shoot.
Right.
And it's like he's talking about, well, he's also said we need something to the effect of we need 3 point makers, not takers. Like it's almost like he doesn't want to shoot threes for the sake of it, but at the same time, I think a lot of it too is just the fatigue from going from Tom Crean, who he had. I remember being at a game against Illinois, I think it was at Assembly Hall, where they made like 18 threes in a game, and then you went from that to Archie Miller, who didn't take threes, to now another coach who's not taking threes, and I think Indiana fans are smart enough to kind of see what's going around the rest of the country, and I don't think their
Of course.
expectation is like let's take 25 threes a game, but there's going to be nights where we got to make 8 to 10 threes and to win, and I don't think that's a crazy uh, way to think like about the game at this point. I think the other kind of point you mentioned about Ballo is I think the one of the problems with Malik Renew is he's obviously a really good offensive player, can score a ton of points, but I think ideally if he was a good enough defender and rebounder, you want to play him at the 5, right? And play Mbako at the 4. Instead, Renew doesn't offer enough on the boards or defensively, and his foul problems are such that you can't really rely on him to play the 5. And so you have this really talented player that can score 20, 25 on a given night in the Big Ten, but you can't play him at the 5. So, in a lot of ways, Khalil Ware was a much better match for Malik Renew than Umar Ballo is, because at least Ware could step out and make a three, could protect the rim. I think Ballo can do that. Ballo's obviously a really good rebounder, so I think they were kind of just in a hard position there with what do you do with Renew. And I know Ballo, from a talent standpoint, he was at the top of a lot of these lists as one of the top transfers in college basketball, and you're not going to turn down a player of that caliber. But I agree with you. I just don't know from a fit standpoint how it all comes together. But it'll be fascinating to watch. What do you think of Rice and Carlisle, and like what kind of upgrade that would provide in terms of talent from what they had last year with Xavier Johnson and Gabe Cupps playing a ton of minutes. I mean, that was another thing that really hurt him a lot. Nothing against Gabe Cupps personally, but he'd have a lot of games where he'd play 20 or 25 minutes, and you look at the box score at the end of the game, and he scores 2 points and has one assist and takes like one shot. And it's like, you can't really have that and expect to be, a team that's winning regularly in Big Ten play.
Yeah, I mean, I really like Carlisle. I think he's going to be a really good scorer. I think Miles Rice is a player I also like a lot, like his size. Um, I think really good defender, which is why I kind of look at this roster and think, if you could really coach these guys to play like lockdown defense, you could really have something here with the size and athleticism. Like they have a chance to play some like bully ball defense, which would be interesting. But I think, you know, putting a guy who is a point guard who shot whatever it is, 29% from three, um, in this setup with, like we've been talking about with the two bigs, we're not going to give you a lot of spacing is tough. I mean, I think if he was a 38% if he was a 38% three-point shooter, he'd be in the NBA. But if he was a 33% or 32% three-point shooter on some volume, you'd look at it and be like, great. Like we'll take the volume, pull up off, we'll run some ball screens for you, pull up off, and we'll do pick and pops with Mbako. Like we'll work stuff out. And I think these guys, again, size is an advantage in some of these setups, but I just don't. Again, the whole thing to me feels like there's good players here. It's not a bad roster by any means. It's a good roster. But I do worry about fit with some of the stuff. And Rice is one of those guys where I feel like in isolation, that's a really good player. And it's a promising player. You'd be happy to pick him up in the portal. A lot of different programs would have been happy to pick him up. But I'm not sure that a guy, even with his other skills, is what you want if you're not going to get any perimeter shooting at all from your 3-4-5 or your 2-3, these various other spots, depending on the lineup configurations that they have. And again, a guy that, as you just mentioned, like if Renew could play the five and you could go small and get up and down a little bit more, then use the size to be more flexible defensively. And you know what I mean? Like let him play 1-4 or 1-3 defensively, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know that it's a great fit on the offensive end, even though I think there's a world in which it can work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so some of like the early, I think Torvik has them top 25. I mean, do you think is the expectation going into next season this should be a top 25 team, or do you think that's aiming a little high based on kind of where they've been? I mean, to me, the talent, I agree with you. The talent feels like it's been upgraded significantly, even though they did lose the top 15 pick. I mean, that was really functionally the only player that they lose that was a huge part of last season's team. Now, Xavier Johnson was in and out of the lineup, but he was a shell of the player he was before. So, but still losing a
And
top
where
15.
was really good, but he's also getting picked top 15 based on like what he could be in the league. You know what I mean?
Right.
He had a really good season, don't get me wrong, but like, he shot, I just pulled it up. He shot 43s last year. And the Heat took him because they look at him and think, okay, this guy fell to us because people have questions about his motor, but we're the Heat, so we're gonna like turbocharge his motor and make him
Mm-hmm.
like and make him a psycho like all the rest of our players or whatever.
Right.
But I think Ware had a good season, but like there were times where like his raw talent. There's a decent chance in like 5 years you look back and be like, wow, Khalil Ware was just a nice college basketball player. He's an all-star now, or what? You know what I mean? Like there's based on the team
Yeah.
that he went to.
Yeah.
But no, I agree. I think the talent has been upgraded. I don't know. I mean, the top 25 feels a little aggressive to go from what they finished in Ken Palm last year, like
91.
91. That to go from 91 to 25 feels like Bart has a algorithm or a mathematical formula. Maybe it's not an algorithm that he has set up that lets him plug and play transfer rankings or minutes or points and rebounds and offensive efficient, the stuff that you look at Umar Balo and be like, oh my God, this guy's one of the best players in the portal without, the system accounting for the stuff that we've been talking about for the last half an hour or whatever it is,
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I can see why they'd be ranked that high mathematically, where I would probably temper my expectations a little bit while again saying like good roster, potentially good team. If the fit works out, if guys can shoot, if the offense can be more dynamic, certainly than it was last year, but just more dynamic relative to its competition in the Big Ten, then yeah, you've got a chance to be a good team. But I don't know that plugging and playing the talent into ranking system necessarily. And again, I don't know that much about Bart's system, so I could be wrong about this. And typically, honestly, him and guys like Ken, their preseason stuff ends up being pretty accurate over time. So it's not like I'm completely dismissing that, but I think there's probably some stuff it might not see that you and I can see.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the good news is the Big Ten feels more wide open than ever going into next season when you add four teams that,
Yeah, when there's like 35 teams in it.
yeah, 18 teams, you got this unbalanced schedule, a chance to compete for a Big Ten title feels a little bit more wide open. Wide open. Last thing I just wanted to ask you about was just the Big Ten in general going into next season with this new setup, these West Coast teams coming in. I mean, you grew up in Iowa, you're a traditional Big Ten guy. You've watched it for a long time. Just kind of your reaction to this expanded league, how it's going to be different now with these four teams, and what other Big Ten teams going into next season are you kind of intrigued to watch and follow when the season tips off coming up in early November?
Great question. I hate the new Big Ten. I was just actually writing about this for the newsletter. I think a couple days ago I saw someone post like one of those, those uh like college basketball report Twitter accounts
Yeah,
that
yeah,
are
yeah.
like
With
they're
the
just kind of
list,
yeah, they
to
do the
try to get
lists
the retweets and the likes and the comments, the
and the
engagement
graphics
farming.
and stuff. Yeah, exactly. And it was like, Big Ten predictions 2024, 25. And it was the first time I'd actually seen one of those things that had the whole league in it. And it like instead of the normal response to for me to those things, which is not even registering it and immediately scrolling past, was like a deep sadness because I just think the idea of what the Big Ten is now with with the West Coast schools, and it's not like they're like invaders and they shouldn't be in the Big Ten and like whatever. It's sad because they killed the Pac-12, which is like a great conference
Yeah,
full of history and tradition and really good schools and people who are on the West Coast were really proud of it. It had its own culture and Bill Walton and all this other stuff. And college towns on the West Coast in the Pac-12 had their own sort of if Big Ten traditional Big Ten college towns have their own sort of Midwest big school, big state school sort of feel. Same very true of the West Coast with their own sort of local culture and stuff. And now it's like we're just going to throw all these teams together, forget the logistics of like making the swimming team go swim at UCLA in the middle of the winter or whatever the case may be. Um, you know, I just look at that list of teams in the same conference and find it to be grim
well,
and
two quick things that really
ridiculous.
annoy me before you continue.
Yeah.
One is the fact that you're going to an 18 team conference and you're only going to play 20 games. So like you basic not the regular season title was already devalued, but now you're devaluing it even more because you've you don't play anything close to resembling a round robin schedule. And two, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but people push back that I hate it. You're gonna have a Big Ten tournament now where you don't even have all the teams coming to the tournament. Like
No,
I
no, I
don't
hate that.
understand.
I think
I
that's
don't
so.
understand. That's what's the why have a conference tournament if you're not going to invite every team? Like I know that it's unrealistic that the 16th, 17th, or 18th seeded team is going to make a run, but you're not even giving them a chance to
Yep.
do that.
No,
It annoys me.
I think it's super wrong. I think one of the nice things about going into Champ Week and the last like 2 weeks of the college basketball season is that like and I Indiana fans should be able to identify with this. There have been plenty of times in the last 25 years where Indiana has gone into the Big Ten tournament with a team that is not good enough to get picked to be in the NCAA tournament. But if they win 4 games and they're not so bad that you can imagine them winning 4 games, could go to the tournament. And I think that is part of what makes that last couple of weeks of college basketball incredible. We saw it this year with NC State. I mean, NC State would have been invited to the ACC tournament under this scenario, but
Right.
there are teams that go on runs. They get weird bounces in their first game and they get confident and they get hot and they win. Georgetown, great example with Patrick Ewing. Did that go anywhere for the program? Did it mean anything? No, but they went to Madison Square Garden where Patrick Ewing used to play as a New York Knick, had four amazing nights, maybe five, honestly. They might have had to win 5 games that year. And they got to the NCAA tournament. And it was a fantastic weekend for everybody involved. And
Yeah.
they might have been last or second to last in the Big East that season. I think it's really silly. And I think the idea has always been nice that's like, look, the regular season's over, but whatever happens, if you just keep winning from here on out, you can get to the NCAA tournament. You could go to the Final Four. Who knows? College basketball's crazy that way. I think it really is awful that for the sake of, look, we want to be a really super big conference, but we don't want to add an extra day to our tournament or inconvenience anybody in any meaningful way. It sucks, dude. I think
Yeah.
it's one of those. I'm glad you brought that up because I had honestly forgotten about that. It's one of the other things that really sucks about making these conferences super huge is, you know, you're just losing like some small bits of culture and heritage along the way of what the sport is supposed to be.
So sorry, I kind of interrupt you there, but I'm just like, who are a couple of teams like next year in the Big Ten that you're intrigued by, like to watch?
Um, so this is funny that this is the first one that I picked, but UCLA,
Yeah.
I feel like it's a pretty big year for Mick Cronin because he has gotten past his initial cycle of like Jaime Jaquez and Tiger Campbell and those guys, which are really the cornerstones of his first 4 years at UCLA, maybe five. Um, and last year they had some flashes. They were talented, but and got better at the end of the year, but had a really rough middle period of the season. And so I think it's a pretty crucial year for him. Personally, I think Purdue is going to be super interesting because it's the start of a new era for them, right? Like, obviously retaining plenty of backcourt talent, but how do is Kaufman Wren so good that you can kind of continue where you left off? I mean, they're not going to continue where they left off in terms of how dominant Zach Edey was, but stylistically, can you effectively be the same? Um, just by promoting a guy that Matt Painter has been pretty high on. If you hear him talk about him in the last couple seasons, especially going into last season, he was like, "We got to figure out a way to get Kaufman Wren more involved." And you're like, "Dude, why? You have Zach Edey. What are you talking about?" And you kind of feel like he does that stuff to keep guys in the program and get them to the point where like, okay, Zach's gone now. This is your year. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes for them. And what's another one here? Uh, Not very exotic given the fact that there's the West Coast teams, but honestly, Michigan State. I think I wrote about them in the middle of the year last year, where like they've kind of entered possibly a state of gradual decline now in
Yeah.
Tom Izzo's late years, where they're just every year it feels like okay, this could they've turned it around, they're good again, and then they end up being a 7 seed or an 8 seed again. It kind of feels like that's been them for a little while now. So failing an arrest of that decline, they're another one that I'm interested to look forward to because that is one of those things that he has occupied that job for so long that it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with it and that program after the fact because they went straight from Judd to him. They've had however many decades of uninterrupted sort of solidity as a program, and there's no guarantee that continues in perpetuity.
Yeah, they're Ken Palm updated his program rankings, I think, now to include last season, which basically looks at the Ken Palm rankings dating back to 1997, and Michigan State sixth on there. So far and away the best Big Ten program for a long time. But I kind of feel like Izzo is gonna have like one final run before it's all said and done, before he
You
kind of
keep
rides
thinking
off
it's
into the
going to be,
sunset.
and he keeps talking like every press conference for him after he loses a game, and this is kind of always the way he's been, which is why people like him. I guess national media, I'm sure there's plenty of Big Ten fans who don't like him that much, but every game, if they lose a game he thinks they shouldn't have lost or his team plays bad, he's like one of those old school coaches who will just come out and, Knight used to do it all the time and Katie used to do it all the time. These guys used to do it all the time where they'd just be like, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I hate my job. I hate my life. Like I can't take this anymore. And
Yeah.
you got these guys who want to play video games and do NIL stuff and play
Be on
Fortnite.
social
And
media.
yeah, the social media stuff is killing us. And I remember that when I was in college, people were talking about social media. And it was like 2007. It's just like, but it's kind of charming, and I think it's one of those things we'll maybe miss when he's gone. But you keep thinking like, okay, he had his breakdown press conference, he's emptied the clip, and now Michigan State's going to go on their Elite Eight run or whatever, and they just kind of haven't really
Yeah.
done it lately, and they just kind of ended up being kind of average, and we'll see how it goes from here.
Well, Eamon, always great to catch up, even though it's the early July. Talk hoops year round here on Podcast on the Brink. I know you do the same at your website, eamonnbrennan.com. Make sure to check that out. He's done a great job with that Substack, and hope to continue to see it flourish in the years to come as an independent content creator here. I know it's an endeavor every week, but it's a lot of fun to kind of be able to call your own shots and do your own thing. So congrats on all the success with there, and thanks for making the time to come on the show.
Likewise, man, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks everybody, as always, for listening to Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, leave us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.